Hey, what's up, Pat? The Freedom listeners, thank you so much for dropping in to another episode. This is episode 114, and my guest is Henry Gonzales. So Henry's someone that I was introduced to by a mutual acquaintance and got to know a little bit. Have really enjoyed, learning from his experience. And, after talking to him one or two times, I was like, Henry, you got to come on the podcast and tell this story. So Henry and his wife are multi-unit franchise owners with Stretch Lab, which is a boutique fitness concept. At least that's how I would describe it. Part of the Exponential Fitness family of brands. And Henry and his wife are, as I said, multi-unit owners. So they've got at least 2 locations open at the time of that we recorded this podcast, and very likely have their 3rd location open by now. So Henry talks a little bit about why they were attracted to franchise ownership in the first place. He shares how he and his wife have been able to balance building their franchise businesses with his corporate career. Henry's a very successful executive in the medical device industry. They have also done real estate investing and continue to do more investing in real estate. So I think some really good perspective from Henry in terms of, how franchise ownership fits into their overall wealth building strategy, and how they've been able to juggle that with the other responsibilities that they have in their life, including Henry's corporate career. So ton of good information here, good perspective. I think everything Henry shares will resonate with so many of you listening in. And I imagine a lot of you listening are, at a similar place to where Henry and his wife were, several years ago, contemplating, how can they add other income streams and ultimately set themselves up to not have to rely on having an employer. One of the things Henry shares in this episode is that at the time of recording, he's actually planning his exit from his corporate company so that he's got more time to focus on the franchise businesses that they're building, the real estate investing, and also just, starting to enjoy some of the flexibility that, their other investments are creating for them. So again, a lot of good information here. Really, really enjoyed hearing from Henry and learning from him myself. So without further ado, let's go ahead and drop in with Henry Gonzales, multi-unit franchise owner for Stretch Lab. Hey, what's up, Path to Freedom listeners? Thank you so much for dropping into another episode. Today, I have the privilege of being joined by Henry Gonzales, and Henry and his wife, Ada, are franchise owners for Stretch Lab, which is a what I would consider, I guess, boutique fitness brand that I've worked with for years now. Henry and I got introduced through a mutual acquaintance, and I thought it'd be great to have him come on the podcast and talk a little bit about his experience as a franchise owner, how he got into it, and where he kind of sees himself going from here as a franchise owner. So Henry, with that, thank you so much for dropping in.
Wes, good morning. Thanks for having me, man. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, likewise.
Heard great things about the show, so it's an honor.
Well, hey, I appreciate that, and I know you're busy, so really appreciate you making the time to do this. I've been looking forward to it. So, tell the audience a little bit more about yourself. Kind of where you live, what you were doing prior to becoming a franchise owner, and also kind of what you still do, because owning a franchise is not the only professional thing that you have going on right now.
Yeah, no, happy to share. So, I live in Raleigh, North Carolina now. We've been here about 7 years, and I'm originally from South Florida, from Miami. I've spent the last 19 years in the medical device space, and it has been just a wonderful journey. Had the privilege to work for some great companies. And so the company I work for now makes robots for surgery. I'm a sales director for them, and just learned a ton. Again, I'm really privileged to work around people who are a lot smarter than me. The desire to kind of go into franchising, man, was probably, I'd say, right before COVID. And during COVID, just some reflection that I think everyone has gone through in some form or fashion of their life. And I reflected like, man, I've had this great run, and listen, I get to do some things, go on a vacation with the family. There's certain privileges, but as I listen to a lot of folks that are mentors or read stories of folks that have been successful, I just noticed that most of them had invested in stocks, real estate, and businesses.
Yeah.
And as I really reflected on my own portfolio, my own journey, I was heavily weighted in really one of those, and that was stocks. I got the privilege to work for a company that had some shares that you could earn over time. Sure. But I was heavily weighted in one of them, and I said, maybe I should diversify that a little bit. And so my wife and I got into vacation rentals. It's kind of like the second pillar, if you will, and we got into a little bit of real estate, and that went really, really well. And then through my wife had a friend who knew, or that friend owned the franchise of Pilates in the Raleigh area. Yeah. Okay. And I was like, man, could we just kind of maybe connect and have lunch with this guy one day? So long and short, got his phone number, called him up, and he's like, yeah, let's meet in a couple of weeks. Let's do lunch. And as I, listened to his journey, his name is David Shook. I consider him a mentor, really brilliant guy. He's actually one of the largest franchise owners now in Exponential.
Oh, really? Does he own more than Club Pilates now? Does he own other of their brands, or he just has a lot of Club Pilates?
So I believe he's still heavily weighted in Club Pilates, but I know he's always open to other things. And so, having lunch with him, just hearing his journey and his background, I'm like, well, listen, this guy kind of comes from a similar walk that I do. And, when he told me, the upside potential of franchising, I was really blown away. I almost didn't believe it, to be honest with you. I was like, yeah, you sure about that? So long and short, my wife and I get on a flight and we go to visit the Expo headquarters. And we were actually looking at like Yoga 6, Club Pilates, and some of their other concepts. And after a couple of days of PowerPoints and what have you, my wife, who's a physical therapist, is walking through the lobby on the way out. And she's like, what's Stretch Lab? I'm like, honey, I don't know. I'm exhausted. Let's go back to the hotel and just call it a day. Yeah. And kudos to her. She's like, no, I want to know what Stretch Lab is. Their chief marketing officer comes out, spur of the moment. His name is Mark. He's absolutely fabulous. And tells us kind of their vision of what it is. And it's to help people with mobility and flexibility. And she goes, I would like to go visit one. Oh. Well, guess where we go that night? We go to get stretched, man, right down the street at one of the studios. And we both get off the bench. We did like a couple stretch, and we call it love at first stretch. We're like, man, that was amazing. That's cool. And we're like, we would love to bring something like this back to Raleigh. I think it could help the community. So we went through to different states, visited studios, talked to owners, did our diligence. And we said, you know what, this helps us solve a problem we're in. And we initially started with 3. We bought the rights to open 3. And shortly thereafter, opening the first, we actually bought the rights to 2 more. And so now we're looking to do 5 and maybe grow from there. Yeah, it's such a cool story. And thank you for sharing that. And there's a couple things I'd love to kind of unpack with all that. But before we do that, just for the audience listening, give us kind of a quick overview. What is Stretch Lab? And you mentioned Exponential Fitness. And so for those that have listened to the podcast for a while now, Exponential Fitness, I've had Lance Freeman, who's an executive with Exponential Fitness, on the podcast. I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes to make it easy for people to find, because he does a good job in that episode, just kind of giving a high level overview of what is Exponential and how do they support the franchise owners across the now 10 brands that they own, all in kind of this boutique fitness sector. But Stretch Lab specifically, you mentioned stretching, but kind of give us at least a high level overview of, what does Stretch Lab provide for their clients? Sure. Well, if you look at the Exponential family, currently there's 10 brands, and there's everything from rowing to yoga to Pilates, what have you. The only recovery concept within those 10, if you think about it, is Stretch Lab. And what we loved about the concept is it's recovery. So it's not competing. It's actually complementary to those brands, in addition to an Orange Theory and F45, right? And so that was very appealing. The other thing we liked about it is the demographic that comes to a Stretch Lab is about 50-50 male to female. We've actually been located next door to Club Pilates, and a lot of the wives come out and go, my husband won't go do yoga, but he would do this because he needs help with flexibility and mobility.
Yep.
And so that's a little bit about Stretch Lab as far as it goes with Expo. And Expo has over 3,000, boutique studios across the globe.
Yeah.
So very seasoned curator of those wellness brands. Stretch Lab, what we do is, we help people to their freedom of movement. And we believe that, you should be able to live your life without constraints. And so if you think about, our clientele who comes in, we have everything from Carolina Hurricane hockey players that come to stretch with us in their off season, to football players, high school athletes, to look, I'm a 46-year-old guy who tries to stay active. If I'm not stretching at my age, dude, you get up a little different in the morning. Let's call it what it is.
No doubt. I mean, I'm 35, and over the last couple of years, I've really come to appreciate stretching, before I do any sort of a workout or training, and also just in the morning, because I mean, I've had back issues and stuff, and we can maybe get into this later, but you actually, you and your wife now own the rights to open Stretch Lab in Wilmington, where I live. So I'm ready for you guys to get a location open, because I promise you I will be a client, and I will be in there on a regular basis, because it makes a big difference, right? Having someone that knows what they're doing, helping you stretch, versus you just, trying to do it on your own.
It does. And one of the gaps that we just saw, because as a business owner, you always look for where is there a problem that you can help solve with a business, right?
Sure.
And with your people. And what my wife saw that I didn't see, her being a PT, was, well, when you go to physical therapy or you're getting some kind of care, there's a limit to how much manual time they can give you. And then after your insurance is up, where do you go to continue to get that help with your mobility or flexibility? And Stretch Lab kind of fills that gap, I think, in wellness, to give people an option to help with that. We do also accept flexible spending and health savings accounts, while we don't bill insurance. Yeah, while we don't bill insurance directly, we're membership based. We do have that option to pay with pre-tax dollars, which is really nice.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's great.
So we really like that unique fit. What Stretch Lab does, they really are taking the PNF technique, which stands for proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. It's just a technique that physical therapists have used for decades. There's tons of literature behind it. If you see athletes on the sidelines in a game, they're working with a trainer getting stretched, they're doing PNF technique. So it's a hold and release technique that just really advances your range of motion. And so all Stretch Lab does is make that available to the masses, where, hey, you can actually get this PNF technique in addition to some technology in the studio to help you measure your results and get more mobile and flexible. And if you're committed to like anything else, it really works.
Yeah. Well, and you made a great point earlier. Like, if you're looking at, because for people that have researched franchise opportunities in the past, right, the fitness sector within franchising is a pretty big sector. I've seen people kind of at first glance say, yeah, it's very saturated, right? But you've got all these different types of fitness businesses, and I use fitness as kind of a broad term, but you've got boutique fitness, which is very different from like an anytime fitness or a 24-hour fitness. It's usually, if you're looking at it kind of from a business model standpoint, smaller footprint. So, your upfront capital requirements are not as high because you don't need as big of a location. But Stretch Lab is very interesting in kind of this, suite of brands that Exponential owns, because it is really the only recovery one. And it's one where you could easily see, and I'm sure you have examples of this in your locations, where you've got members with Stretch Lab, but they're also members with at least one other Exponential fitness concept, because it is that recovery. The other thing I've kind of noticed with Stretch Lab, because I've worked with a few people over the past year and a half, 2 years, that have gone on to start Stretch Lab franchises, and a couple of the other Exponential brands as well. But Stretch Lab's really interesting to me too, because it seems like you have kind of a wider demographic of client that you could target, right? You could have, even someone that's a little bit older, that's probably not, a monthly member for like a Club Pilates or even like an, F45 or Orange Theory. You mentioned those earlier, but stretching and maintaining that mobility is going to be good for them, right? You could even have younger people, right? I've heard, got a guy out in Oklahoma City that owns a stretch lab, and he's got, kids that will come in. It could be rehabbing an injury or whatever. But the other thing that's interesting to me about it, and curious, if you guys have seen this, especially with your wife being a physical therapist, there seems to be more opportunity with Stretch Lab compared to most other kind of boutique fitness brands to develop strategic referral partnerships, right? Where you could go and network with orthopedic surgeons and, anyone that's already got kind of a client base or has patients that are going to benefit, whether it's long-term or at least short-term, from having someone that knows what they're doing, stretch them out and help them increase and improve their mobility. So those are kind of things that have really stuck out to me, specific to Stretch Lab, that really differentiates it from a lot of other models or concepts in kind of the same category. And there's a lot of other great concepts as well, but Stretch Lab is very unique. And those are things that I've always really kind of appreciated about it.
Yeah, I agree. Just recently, my wife and I met with the president of one of the largest physical therapy companies in the state of North Carolina, actually nationally for that matter. And he shared with us they have about 600 patients a month that insurance is done, and these folks need to transition to some other modality of care. Now, currently, when we met with their teams in one of their offices, they may refer them to massage or a personal trainer that maybe has some specialization. But there isn't really a set go-to transition for these folks. And that's where I think Stretch Lab really has an opportunity to help people with that continuous pathway of care. So we're excited about that. I think the opportunities are endless. And, man, when we opened the first studio, it was in January of last year. It was still during the pandemic. And we weren't sure how that was going to go, I got to be honest.
Yeah, it's tough timing.
It was tough timing, but I tell you, the amount of people that were coming in saying, you know what, I'm just not as mobile. I Zoom for work. I sit for 8 hours a day. I drive now for hours on end, and I need help. My lower back and my hamstrings and my hips are just, concrete.
Yeah.
And these are people that not only it's their daily routines that are making it tight, but they're still also trying to be active and do things.
Sure.
And so we saw such an opportunity to help the community. And it was very eye-opening, and that hasn't changed.
Yeah, and I don't expect it will. I mean, the modern kind of life that most of us lead is great in a lot of ways, but it's also not very conducive for like good posture. And like I'm hunched over my desk. Like I've had to buy a stand-up desk and like a balance board and like all this stuff because I spend so much time in my office, and it really has taken a toll on my back, my neck, hips, all of that. So no doubt the need will continue. And the other thing that's been interesting to see, at least from my perspective over the last several years, is, one of the, in my eyes, positive that came out of, the pandemic is that a lot more people do seem to be wanting to be more proactive about taking care of themselves. It seems like, for a lot of people, there's kind of this awareness that, hey, there's a lot of things that I can proactively do to, make me less susceptible to getting sick and to give me more longevity and just help me, live a better life and do the things that I want to do. And Stretch Lab fits into that very nicely. I want to get a little bit perspective in terms of, because one of the things I talk with anyone that I'm working with that is interested in exploring franchise opportunities, as you know, I do consulting. So I've got kind of this network of franchise companies, about 250 of them that I've worked with and have relationships with and have a pretty good understanding of their business. The first thing I talk with people about, besides kind of what are your goals, is we work to define what I call their ideal role as a business owner, right? Because that's going to look different depending on the type of business that you're in. So, you mentioned earlier, your career in medical devices, right? Which is a very lucrative career. And so talk to us a little bit about what is your role as the owner looked like since you started Stretch Lab, because you've been doing this while continuing to grow your corporate career, correct? So share with us kind of what that's looked like, and where do you spend most of your time and energy as an owner of Stretch Lab?
Sure. So, I'll tell you, it's been probably almost a 3-year journey from the time that we took that trip out to California to where we are today, with now the second studio opening and looking at the third by year end. And look, man, I'm not going to lie. There's a lot of nights and weekends, and Sundays that we have put in. Now, I was fortunate in that I had my wife, who's more of the face and has been there more for the day-to-day operations, because I'm very limited because I have a commitment I have to keep still to my employer, and I have.
Sure.
But my role's been more, helping with hiring behind the scenes of, negotiating leases, working with the attorneys, right? All the things you have to do behind the scenes to create a team to build your organization. And so while I love to be customer facing, I just haven't been able to as much because of my other obligations.
Sure.
That will change going into next year. My wife and I have made a decision to transition to this fully together, and we couldn't be more excited about it.
Awesome.
But that, when you meet with Expo, they'll tell you, hey, it's an absentee owner model. Maybe that works for some. I think you still, especially when the business is young and you're building a team, there's a lot of owner involvement. So I want to, be clear with that there's going to be a lot of time put in.
Yeah.
A lot of time.
There has to be, especially with location number one. Right. And I'll be curious, so you're getting ready to open number 2, or is number 2 already open?
No, number 2 is now open. And
okay.
My analogy, it's, I'll tell you, from a growth perspective, as much as, like my current job, I lead a team of about 40 people, and I have managers that roll up to me. So I'm used to like scaling, delegating, and building teams to run without you. It's almost like you have to learn it all over again as a business owner. It's the craziest thing. And so, Studio One was a monster success. It's one of the highest revenue studios in the country.
Wow.
And then you got to go open number 2. And I use the analogy, it's almost like children, like, that first child you're so protective with. And, if the thing falls on the floor, you're boiling it in 30 seconds, right? Sterile. And then you have a second when you're like, all right, 3-second rule. Like, you let some things go. And it's hard. But at the same time, if you don't do that, you never let the teams grow without you and learn. And you got to be okay with letting them make mistakes. And it's almost accepting, you're trying to expect excellence, but not perfection.
Yeah, exactly. That's such a good point, I think, for people to hear, because look, the vast majority of people, at least that I work with, their whole reason for exploring franchise opportunities and being drawn to business ownership is, at least long term, they want to create more freedom for themselves, right? They want to have more control of their time. Well, as a business owner, you have to be able to build teams and delegate in order for that to actually become a reality. Unfortunately, a lot of people get into business and they end up working harder and far more for a long time than they did before they were business owners. So that kind of letting go, I think, is challenging for a lot of business owners. I know, my wife and I have struggled with that a little bit in the franchises that we own, which are very different types of businesses than something like a Stretch Lab. But, but the first franchise we started, which we still have, there's an in-home sales component, right? So my wife kind of dove in the beginning. She ran all of our sales appointments for at least the first 6 months before she really started building out a sales team. And I can remember her really struggling because she was just naturally great at it for whatever reason. She was in pharmaceutical sales before. So she hadn't done anything like that, but naturally good at it, enjoyed it. She had a lot of trouble letting go with, we call them designers, our salespeople, letting new designers go run appointments. And she would go and shadow, but she'd kind of been told by a more experienced franchise owner in that business, hey, the best thing to do is just stand back and watch and then coach afterwards. Don't interject. Don't try to bail them out. And so my wife would always refer to it as watching the train wreck happen. And she, she'd come home after like riding on a couple of sales appointments with a newer designer and just be like, literally my tongue was almost bleeding in my mouth because I was biting my tongue so hard trying not to interject and just watching the train wreck happen. But that's important, right? Because that's the only way you can get that type of scale. If you're listening to this podcast, then there's a good chance that you're looking to create more freedom in your own life. There's also a good chance that you realize that owning your own business can be a great way to take more control of your livelihood and create more of that freedom that we're all looking for. Also, if you've been listening to the show for a while, you realize that I specialize in franchise ownership. In addition to owning franchise businesses myself, I have a franchise consulting firm, Path to Freedom, where I help people navigate what is typically an overwhelming process of understanding franchising, identifying specific franchise companies that could be a fit, and then conducting the due diligence in a thorough and efficient manner with those franchise brands. My whole purpose here is to leverage my experience working for franchisors, owning franchises myself, and how we've been able to use that to create more freedom in our lives and help you determine if that could be a path that makes sense for you as well. So if any of this sounds interesting, if you've considered business ownership in the past, whether you've explored franchising specifically or not, I'd love to connect with you. I'd love to learn more about you and what it is that you're working towards in your life and determine if I may be in a position to help. A great starting point is the link below in the show notes, which will take you to a short form to fill out, and you'll receive a free copy of an ebook that I've put together, The 7 Steps to Freedom Through Franchise Ownership. That'll also get us connected, and I'd love to set up an introductory call where I can explain a little bit more about the process that I use to help people determine if franchise ownership could be a great way to start charting their own path to freedom. So click the link below in the show notes, receive the ebook, and let's get connected. I'd love to hear from you. And I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier. You said absentee ownership. That's another important point for people to understand, because I connect with a lot of people that are similar to you, right? They've got a great corporate career, good income, good benefits. Like, they'd be crazy to walk away from that. But they have this kind of desire, like you described, that they want to diversify, they want to have multiple income streams, and ultimately they just want to be in a place where they don't have to rely on an employer if they don't want to, right? And so I have to really make sure there's realistic expectations when I'm talking with someone like that. And one of the very first things I tell them is there is no such thing as an absentee franchise. There are franchises that are kind of designed so that you as the owner, it doesn't necessarily need to be your full-time working priority. You know, if you have a career where you have good flexibility in your schedule and you kind of control your schedule, there are franchises that are kind of designed for those types of owners. I would say Stretch Lab is one of them. So I call it semi-absentee. And even with that, you really still have to do the due diligence on the specific franchise you're looking at. And you have to really understand, all right, what's going to be expected of me, or what's going to be necessary of me as the owner to make sure this is successful? And do I have the bandwidth to actually do that? It's always great when there's, a spouse involved and you can kind of divide and conquer, the roles of the owner. But that's something that I think is important. And the other thing is your role as the owner changes over time, right? I would imagine that how you spend a lot of your time today is not exactly the same as it was when you were trying to get your very first location open. I would imagine it's changed some and will continue to as you open more locations.
Yeah, I think it transitions from like operator to, you have to transition a mindset of now that I've built a team, right? So before it was like me, wife, maybe one other person, and then you start to scale. You got to transition mindset of, all right, now my job is to remove obstacles for people, right? And if I can remove those obstacles for people to ensure their success, then they continue to grow and get better. And I tell my wife all the time, like, don't think of the team you have today, but think of the team you'll have in a year if you make deposits every day. right?
Yeah.
And that's the vision we try and create. What I love about the franchise model that I think is so great, especially for folks that are trying to transition like from corporate America to doing like their own business, is corporate America likely taught you, you know, a business will run great if you got the right people, the right process, and the right culture, right? And what I love about franchising is they kind of create that process for you that if you just execute the playbook, it probably goes pretty well.
Yeah.
And so instead of having to create your own payroll system or your own point of sale system and, you know, best practices and training programs, that would take, I don't know how many hours and years to create. They kind of already do that really well. And then your job is to make sure it executes and the process goes well and you create a great culture within your own company so that people stay with you, want to grow with you. And if you do that well, it can be very rewarding.
Yeah, it's very well said, because it's true. And that's where, you know, doing the research, right, is so important, though, because not all franchises are created equally, right? So, you know, you want to get into a franchise like Stretch Lab where they've got the systems and processes, they've got a track record, and you know it works. You know, you're able to look at and talk to other franchisees that are, you know, further ahead, and they're having success because they're following the systems and the playbook. So that's such a good point. And, you know, it's something I run into a lot, and I'm curious your thoughts on this because, you know, from what I know about your background and your wife's background, Stretch Lab really does kind of seem like a natural fit, right? You've been in medical devices, you know, company that builds robots for surgery. Like there's some synergy there. And then with your wife being a physical therapist, definitely, you know, some similarities, I would imagine. Do you feel like if you and your wife had different career tracks than what you have, do you feel like you still could have been successful with a concept like Stretch Lab? Does that question make sense?
It does. I think you can. You know, I think I take it back to if you still build the right people, the right process, right culture, you can make any concept, you know, probably do pretty well. I think it was just a unique fit for us because she comes with a passion of improving people's lives and how they move, being a physical therapist.
Yeah.
And I had the good fortune of working for organizations that they weren't about just driving revenue. They were about a mission. And if you could get behind a mission and, you know, so for us, it's, hey, how do we help the Raleigh community or the Wilmington community get more mobile and flexible? And you keep that as your North Star. Everything else takes care of itself. You're probably going to open more locations. You're probably going to be financially, you know, happy with the results.
Yeah.
But it's got to be mission first. And so this really called out to us, probably because it was a unique fit. But we're so behind the mission to help the community that it just keeps us grounded.
Yeah, I love that. That is so important, you know, to understand. I think that, you know, if you do get into business for yourself, like you really need to have a bigger why than just, hey, I want to make money, right? Because that stuff will come if you keep your clients and your employees, your team, you know, first and foremost, right? If you do the right thing by them, everything else you want will likely follow: the revenue, the profits, the freedom of time. So I love that. And I agree. I mean, it sounds like, I mean, Stretch Lab, just a very unique fit for you guys. And I love the story of how, you know, you went out to meet with Exponential, not even thinking of Stretch Lab, and just kind of happened to ask about it, and it all came together. That's amazing. But yeah, it's a misconception I run into, right, with people that I work with, especially the people that have been, you know, very successful in corporate America. They look at a lot of the different types of franchises out there and they're like, well, I don't have any experience in that industry, so how could I ever own, you know, a business that does that? And I think what you described in terms of kind of where your time is best spent as an owner, you know, really building, managing, leading teams, creating that culture, that's what people that are successful in corporate America and have kind of climbed the ranks with larger companies, that's what they learn. That's what they do. And that's what franchisors are looking for in their franchise owners. You know, there's always exceptions to that, but the majority of franchisors, they don't necessarily want their franchise owner being on the front lines, providing the product or the service themselves, at least not long-term. they want leaders, that can kind of have that vision and build the teams and set the pace for how to get there.
Yeah, I'll tell you, in this journey, people will have more transferable skills from the things they've done to franchising than they realize. And I would urge any of your listeners, just, man, take out a piece of paper, write down what are just 3 or 4 things that you're really great at, and just double down on that. For me, I was able to build orgs with talent to do more, and I could run great process. So I'm like, hey, man, what can I apply that to? Just double down on that.
Yeah.
And so far, franchising has been kind of that next step for me. I look at my wife. I mean, she spent almost 20 years as a PT. She didn't have direct reports or anything. It's pretty humbling to watch her go in there and be probably better at business than me. But I say that, one, because my admiration for her, but the other is, man, you can YouTube, read, or ask a mentor about just about anything. And if you just have a mindset of solving problems and figuring things out, you're going to be fine.
Yeah.
And watching her is an inspiration of, she just figures things out. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Sounds very similar to my wife. We probably need to get them introduced, because Andy Pittman, who introduced us, would be the first person to tell you that any success we've had in our Shelf Genie franchise, which is how Andy and I know each other, is 110% due to Kelly, my wife, and nothing to do with me, which is accurate. But man, it has been amazing to watch, her just kind of figured. She didn't have that, she worked in a few years in pharmaceutical sales. I think she was 26 or 27 when we started our first franchise. So she didn't have like a huge, business background at that point. She just figured it out. Right. And so I think that's so important to understand too, right? Is like, owning a franchise it's not turnkey in the sense that it's all going to be done for you. It's turnkey in the sense that a lot of it's already been figured out, but you as the owner still have to implement and execute. Right.
Yes.
And then I think in a lot of cases, I mean, this varies from one type of franchise to the next, but in a lot of cases, the best franchise owners, once their business is kind of established, they followed the playbook kind of to a T to get it to a certain point, but then they like to push the envelope a little bit. They like to think outside of the box. And I think really good franchise brands encourage that, because it's how they can continue to innovate and improve the system as a whole. So I think that mentality is definitely important. Did you guys struggle at all with what I call FUD, right? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Were there ever any moments, before you actually signed the agreements with Stretch Lab, or, wired them any money, or even after the fact, right? Where you were like, this is crazy. What are we doing? Are we sure we should do this? There's a lot of risk involved. I mean, any of that?
Oh my gosh. Not yes. Hell yes.
Yeah.
I probably have a little bit more gray on my head than 3 years ago when we started the journey. No, I say that kidding. Absolutely. Honestly, it was maybe at some points, if you really think about it, terrifying.
Yeah.
And what I finally landed on, it was probably 3 years of going back and forth of like, well, should we do this?
Mm-hmm.
And then should we do this full time? Like, should I commit myself to just being an entrepreneur? And, it was 3 years of doubt. I got to be honest. It was almost torturous, like this remuneration of thinking about it over and over. And what I finally landed on that just really helped me was, man, what's the worst thing that could happen? And then I wrote that down and I made peace with it.
Mm.
And if you just make the peace of, hey, what's the worst thing that could happen? And you're okay with if that happens, let that fear actually be the energy that fuels and drives you to succeed. And I reflected back on, man, when I was in my 20s and I had nothing. And it was nothing but grit and fear and like, hey, I got to pay a mortgage now. Like, I got family I'm starting, right? Remember that feeling?
Yeah.
Almost go back to that a little bit and let that be your fuel, and believe in yourself, be at peace with the worst case scenario. Just go forward.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing what can happen.
Oh, it's such good advice. Because it's normal, right? I mean, anyone, we own 2 franchise brands now, right? I was scared when we did the second one. It doesn't necessarily get easier, just because you've even done it before. Like it's different, and there's still that uncertainty and doubt there. But so that's how we're wired as humans, right? Like anytime we're about to step out of our comfort zone and do something that we haven't done before, we start trying to convince ourselves why we shouldn't. And so I think that advice is so good. Just kind of, really think through, like, logically too, what are the worst case scenarios? Because I think a lot of times our minds run wild with these kind of worst case scenarios. But if we really sit down and think about it, it's like, okay, that's probably not realistic. What's a realistic worst case scenario? I don't know if you're familiar with Tim Ferriss or not, but I've read a lot of his books, big fan of his podcasts and stuff. But so he did a TED talk years ago that has been really helpful to me. I share it sometimes with people that I work with, and basically says the same thing you just said, right? Which is, if you're struggling with a decision because of like fear or doubt, take out a piece of paper, write down not only what is the worst case scenario, but also write out, what can I do to prevent this from actually happening? And then write out, okay, even if I do these things and the worst case scenario still happens, which is pretty unlikely, what can I do to get back to where I am today? And he said, 9 times out of 10, if you really go through that exercise logically, you'll realize that the worst case scenario is not as bad as you initially imagined. There's a lot of things that you can proactively do to try to, prevent that from happening. And even if it does happen, it's not as hard as we imagined to get back to where we are today. So I think that's great advice, because anyone going down this path or considering going down this path is going to struggle with the FUD, right? The fear, the uncertainty, the doubt. One thing,
one thing I want to add to that. I just, what we landed on, and I heard Jeff Bezos say this in a talk he did, but he asked himself, when he looked back and he's in his 70s or 80s, would he ever regret not trying to build Amazon and taking a shot at it? Or would he be okay with it? And he said, that would be one of my biggest regrets, of not trying to build this company.
Yeah.
And my wife and I just said, what would we regret more? Staying with, a 9-to-5, or trying something new? And we're like, no, I would regret not having given it a shot. It would kill me to see Stretch Lab do really well nationally, not have been a part of that, right? And we just decided to go that route.
Yeah, that I love that too, because that was a mindset shift that I had, at some point, where it was like the fear of regret became more powerful than the fear of trying it and it not working out. I think if you can get to that point mentally, because it's one thing that people do overlook, right? They if we're talking franchising, they're looking at a franchise opportunity. They really look at the risk of, what happens if I do this and it doesn't go well. They don't usually spend as much time thinking about the risk of not doing something.
Yeah. And the knowledge you gain, I think that's really what you've got to, you've really got to make that also one of your end goals. It's not how many locations can open or how well can they do. It's, if this all goes to hell tomorrow, if I've learned everything I've learned in the last 3 years, man, I could do even something better the next time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would have had that knowledge 3 years ago, having not taken that first step. So
that's such a good point. I'm curious, what is franchising? What is owning franchises? Really just becoming a business owner. What does that set you and your family on track to do that you weren't already on track? You've got a great career, right? Like, I imagine you guys didn't need to start a franchise, right? It was something you wanted to do, right? And you had good reasons for it, but it wasn't like hey, we have to do this because otherwise our lifestyle is going to suffer. So what would you say owning businesses now has set you on track to do that you weren't maybe on track to prior to that?
It's a great question, Wes. I would tell you to break the cycle. And what I mean by that is the majority of us, myself included, we're programmed to go to school, get a job, make a W-2, pay a lot of taxes. And, maybe, if you get to your 60s, you'll have enough to hang up your cleats.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I want that for my daughters. I have 2 young daughters that are watching what we're doing. And I don't know that I want that for them. I don't regret my journey because I learned so much from it. And there's a reason why I went through it. But I don't necessarily agree with that programming.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have a neighbor of mine. He's actually a few doors down, a great guy. This was right when I started the journey about 3 years ago. He actually sent me a paper. He retired at 55 from Chrysler. And it was a study done back in the 90s. And it talked about life expectancy and retirement age in corporate America. And so it looked at companies like IBM, Boeing, different companies. There was a trend, and it basically showed that for anyone that worked beyond the age of 49, for every year that they worked, their life expectancy dropped by 2 years.
Wow. Whoa.
And guess what? The study actually showed if you retired at 65 on average, if you stayed in corporate America, you have a life expectancy of 18 months. Beyond 65 on average. And they track this by looking to see when the pension stopped paying and why. And so if you think of, look around you. I mean, I see it in my own company. There's people in their late 40s or 50s. You don't think their health issues are starting to pop up? Now, I'm not saying it's all just corporate America is bad and it's creating a health problem, but there's a stress tolerance that over time is more difficult to withstand. And I'm not saying franchising or owning a business doesn't come with stress and challenges, but I think it's a different kind.
It is. Yeah, I agree. It's very different because it's you own it, right? At least for us, the stress has been far more tolerable because it's all tied to something that we're building for us versus this kind of thought of we're building this for someone else. That's interesting. That study. I mean, I brought up Tim Ferriss earlier, but I read his book, 4 Hour Work Week. I mean, probably 7 or 8 years ago. And it really changed the way I was thinking, about what I wanted to do with my career. I just started getting into kind of the franchise world, working for some franchisors. So kind of, surrounded by more entrepreneurial. I worked for a huge company right out of college for a couple years. And for a period of time, I was like, yeah, I just want to climb the ladder. Like I, want to be vice president, whatever. Started kind of changing the way I thought about it. But, Tim Ferriss in that book brings up an interesting point, and I don't remember exactly how he worded it, but essentially it's like, look, we are programmed to go to college, get the job, work until we're 65, and then retire and have this very little period at the end of our life where we kind of get to do what we want to do and live life. And he's like, unfortunately, a lot of people never even really take the time. Like they have this kind of vision of, all right, after I retire, this is what I want to do. But he's like, a lot of people get to that point and they realize, I don't enjoy this. Like, some people are like, I want to move and just live on the beach, or I want to be able to play golf every day. And he's like, and then they get there, they realize I hate golf and I don't want to play golf every day. Right. But I worked my entire life to get here. So anyways, just again, a mindset shift, but I love that, break the cycle. And I think, for someone like you, I would imagine just a new challenge, right? You've had a lot of success over the course of your career, wanted to challenge yourself with something a little bit different, which I can definitely relate to as well.
Yeah. And I just realized, as I just dabbled my foot in the real estate and dabbled a little bit in the franchising, the returns I was seeing, and not only the returns, but the tax advantage of those returns was so much superior. I mean, hell, even if I have shares of company stock, the second I sell them, half of it goes to Uncle Sam. There ain't no two ways about it.
That's right.
You can call your accountant all day long. They're taking it, guys. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the way the system's designed. And so, when you have equity in your own company or you have real estate and, there's different avenues to, have a tax advantage of those, it was far exceeding what I could earn as a high paid sales executive in a very lucrative field.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, my wife kept telling me, she's like, the only regret you're going to have when you do this is looking back 5 years, kicking yourself you didn't do it sooner. Because I know what you can do, and you're already seeing it. And I, she believes in it, and I believe in it. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah, it's inspiring to hear. So, I mean, Talk to me a little bit about that. So I think you said at the end of the year, you're
Mhm.
kind of retiring from the corporate job, transitioning more full-time into entrepreneurship. So, I mean, as we sit here today, obviously this could change, but, what do you see the next 5 to 10 years looking like? You've already kind of told us you've got the rights to open 3 more Stretch Lab locations. Do you see yourself doing more in franchising, more in real estate? I mean, what are you kind of, especially as you have more time to focus on it, what's kind of the vision as of now?
Yeah, great question. I've thought a lot about this. Look, for the next 5, we want to get the initial 5 locations opened that we discussed. I think we'll do that well over the 5-year timeline for sure. But it's making sure we can adjust our mindset to grow teams to run without us and being okay with not perfection, but hey, let's shoot for some excellence.
Yep.
We'll probably reinvest a lot of that into real estate. Like I said, I was already heavily weighted on one side of things, which was stock, but we really want to go into the real estate deeply.
Yeah.
And so that I see us doing over the next 5 years as well, and growing that portfolio. What I've noticed in franchising, just in business, look, you're always going to have ups and downs. The economy is going to be up, it's going to be down. It's inevitable. But you notice people still survive and move forward decades and decades through just about wars, you name it, inflation, gas embargoes,
pandemics,
right? And so what we've kind of noticed is, if you're a good operator and you can run, a good business, when those downturns come, a lot of times there's an opportunity to maybe acquire someone that wasn't a good operator and grow and expand your portfolio. And so, we'll be looking out for those opportunities. Maybe that's adding more Stretch Labs, maybe something completely different.
Yeah.
But I also see there's definitely a path of, you can open a brand new location, or you can acquire one and turn it into something higher performing. And sometimes that's even more lucrative. And I think that's probably our next wave to explore. And I've already had discussions around that and expressed my interest in that. So we'll see.
I love that. That's smart. That's very smart. And I totally agree that, when we have these kind of downtimes, the people that are willing to be a little more aggressive and are in a position to be a little more aggressive and smart with any sort of an investment, it's a great opportunity to really kind of level up in a big way. We kind of, working towards very similar things as you, right? We've got these kind of pillars that we're trying to build out, because we don't want all of our eggs in one basket. We kind of started with the franchises, right? And that helped us get to a point where we didn't have to rely on employers. We had good income, had more resources. So we've started getting into a little bit of real estate. Definitely want to do more of that. And we've been putting money into the market, but we're at a point now, especially as we kind of are in a downturn right now, like we're going to get pretty darn aggressive and buy stuff while it's cheap, and just ride it out. Right. So yeah, it's interesting to hear, some of the similarities in I guess the way of thinking, but I couldn't agree more that, right now we're recording this in July of 2022. If you've got the resources, this is a time to get aggressive in a smart way versus kind of hunkering down and having this mentality of we just got to ride out the storm. So I love hearing that. What other advice would you share for someone listening that's, maybe had a lot of thoughts that are similar to what you've described that you and your wife are doing and working towards, but they're a little further behind, or they just haven't quite pulled the trigger yet? Any other advice or anything you'd want to share with the audience?
Talk to people that have done it. And what you're going to find is they had the same fears you did, the same obstacles you did. And if they can figure out a way to get it done, so can you. Yeah. So can you. Just make your peace with it. I'll tell you, I still remember vividly, this was probably 6 months ago, I hit a breaking point where I was considering getting out and selling and just walking away from the franchising. And the reason for that was the labor market was really tight. I'm trying to open a second location. I can't find talent to save my life. And I called David, one of the seasoned franchise owners, and I talked it through with him. And he said, hey, man, I'd never forget his words. He just said, make sure you're not making an emotional decision because of a speed bump.
Ooh. Yeah.
And I said, you know what? Because he goes, it may be shorter term than you think.
Mm.
And so what happened was, since I was struggling to find talent, it caused us to innovate. And I found some other avenues to recruit. Long and the short, we actually built out the best team we've had. We're fully staffed.
Wow.
And had I, in that moment, bailed out early and just sold for probably a fraction of what it would have been worth versus staying the course, and that innovation helped me learn how to now recruit even better, I would have regretted it.
Yeah.
So when you get those dark moments, pick up the phone and call someone who's had them too, and talk it through, and don't make an emotional knee jerk.
Such good advice. Talk to people that have already done the things you're trying to do. It's such good advice. And it's another great thing about, being in a great franchise brand, right? Or in this case, a great family of brands with Exponential, because not only do you have the chance to talk to people that are maybe further ahead of you, but like literally they're building the same business that you're building, right? So the challenges, the frustrations, the problems, they're very familiar with them. And that can be a tremendous resource, especially as a newer owner in a franchise, being able to talk to more experienced franchise owners. That's something that, you can't necessarily put a dollar amount on when you're doing the due diligence, but it's so intrinsically valuable and something I always point out to people. So great advice.
Yeah, have your tribe. You got to build a little bit of a tribe of people. And, Wes, I hope to have you in my tribe, man. It sounds like we got a lot of similarities, right?
Likewise.
But have people in your tribe to help you out in those moments. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, I don't know what else we can wrap this up on a better note than with that piece of advice right there. But yeah, Henry, man, really glad that we connected. Looking forward to getting to know you and Ada better. And just wish you continued success with Stretch Lab, your transition into kind of full-time entrepreneurship and all the other ventures that you guys may get into in the future. So really, really appreciate you taking time to share your story. I know that everyone who listens is going to get a ton of value from it. So really, really appreciate you dropping in here on the Path to Freedom podcast.
Thanks, Wes. Been a pleasure. And, any of your listeners that, want to bounce something off me, my line's always open. I feel it's my duty and mission to help others with the journey as well and pay it back. So
I love that. Are you all right if I put your LinkedIn profile in the show notes? That'll make it easy for people to find you that way if they want to.
Absolutely.
Love it. Henry, thank you so much, man.
Okay. See you, Wes.